So what is the number one method to achieving great photos from your smartphone camera? Well, the answer is HDR, which stands for High Dynamic Range. Have you ever heard of it? Well, it's a setting on most smartphones that, when used properly, will improve your photos dramatically. When HDR is turned on, your smartphone will actually take two photos of the same scene and combine them into one photo. Before I show you some examples, we need to understand why we even need to have an HDR setting. You see, our eyes can see way more shades of gray than a camera can. This concept is called dynamic range, and it's basically the level of brightness that a camera sensor can capture from the darkest to the lightest. For the most part, the human eye has a much wider dynamic range than can be captured by the camera, even professional cameras like DSLRs. So it means that at a certain point, on the left, all the pixels captured by the camera are going to be black, whereas the human eye can still see things with varying shades of gray. Similarly, on the right, all pixels seen by the camera are going to be white, while our eyes can still distinguish subtle tones and shades. So as you can see, our eyes see things totally different than our smartphone camera does. When we are photographing a scene where there's a wide dynamic range, your smartphone camera will try to automatically capture the scene as best it can, which is usually taking an average of the light on the foreground and the light on the background. This usually gives us a pretty boring photo because usually only one area of the photo has enough light on it. A lot of times this happens when there's a bright sky in the background and a dark subject in the foreground, as this photo shows. Here's how HDR works. It takes a photo exposing for the dark foreground. This is what that photo looks like. To get enough light to make the foreground look good, the camera had to let in enough light, but that totally overexposed the background sky. Then it takes another photo of the scene exposing for the light background. Now, the background looks great, but the foreground is way too dark. But look what happens when HDR is turned on. It has combined the two photos together digitally, and now you have a photo that has good exposure for the background and the foreground. It's kind of magic, right? Well, not quite, but using HDR can make some of your photos look great. Now, I said some of your photos. Not every photo you take will call for using HDR. A well-lit portrait, for example, will not need HDR because it's not a high dynamic range scene. Landscape scenes like the one above are perfect for HDR. So let's take a look at a few HDR images. In this photo, the rocks in front were really dark without HDR. By turning on HDR, it brightened them up and made the photo much better. In this photo, the original was kind of bland and the clouds were kind of washed out. This time, I actually took the original image and used an editing app that has an HDR function and applied the HDR filter to the image. This is also a great way to make your photos really pop. The photo was edited in one of my favorite apps called Dynamic Light. Now, here's the same photo edited in Dynamic Light, but with the setting turned way up. Some people kind of like this cartoonish effect that you can get with some HDR software. I think it's kind of fun, but I often don't bump it up this much. This photo was also edited in Dynamic Light, and I like the way it brought out the wispy details in the clouds. In this photo, I used the HDR feature in my smartphone, but also brought it into another app I really like, Photoshop Express, and bumped up the contrast and the color, which kind of gave it an HDR effect in the clouds. Okay, so let's take a look how this is done on an iPhone. First, I actually have HDR already turned on and I needed to turn it off, so I tap on the HDR setting on the top of the screen. It went from yellow to white. Now I'm going to take a picture with it off. And now, turn it back on. So you can see it goes from yellow to white, indicating that it's turned on. And now, I'm going to take another picture. And that's it, folks. It's that simple. Okay, now let's take a look at these photos. Here's the first shot without HDR turned on. You can see how the bricks and the columns are very dark. Now here's the photo with HDR turned on. You see how it brought the lightness out in the bricks and the columns, and they're brighter, and there's lots more detail. It's not a huge amount of difference, but it's much improved. I still would probably take this image into an editing app, and I might lighten up the whole image just a bit more, and it would look great. On most smartphones, you can turn on or off the ability of the camera to save the original image or just keep the HDR version. I like to keep both versions just in case I don't like the HDR version. You never know. Okay, now this is how it looks on a Samsung Android smartphone. First, I'll take a photo with no HDR. Then, I'll touch the Mode button and select Rich Tone HDR, and I'll take another photo. It takes the photo and processes the image, And, well, that's it. Now remember, the HDR setting on your Android smartphone may differ. Refer to your user manual for the exact directions. Okay, so here's the first image. Again, the brick columns are very dark and the sky's blown out. And the HDR photo with the brick columns, there's much more detail. The sky is blue, and it's just a much better photo. So, as you've seen, in the right situation, using the HDR setting on your smartphone will give you great looking photos. Thanks for watching.